Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Brian Johnson. I'm the president of MassMedic, and it's my pleasure once again to welcome you to our MassMedic webinar series. Today is the third part in our webinar series in conjunction with metadata, discussing clinical trials and the future of clinical trials. The first two parts of this presentation are available on our YouTube site, and metadata as well will be making them available. We are recording this presentation, so you'll be able to get a copy of it at the end of today when we send out a note to all attendees and registrants. Just a quick note, you are all in mute mode, but in case you do not or accidentally unmute yourself, please, for the sake of our presenters, make sure that you are on mute during the presentation. There will be time for Q&A, and we'll have that towards the end of the presentation, but you can submit your questions anytime using the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. So today we're talking about the new world, connecting patient data and devices with deep analytics. And our expert speakers today are Troy Schneider. He's the Senior Director of Imaging Strategy at Metadata, and Aaron Goloznik, and he's the Head of Research at Acorn AI, which is also a metadata company. I believe Troy will be presenting first, so I'm going to hand it off to him, and I will be back to moderate Q&A towards the end of the presentation. Thank you so much to both of you for joining us. Troy, please.
Thanks, Brian. Hi, everybody. I think today's topic is incredibly timely, considering, companies are really looking to reinvent both the way they do research, but also the way they approach commercial engagements and the commercialization of their devices. And it's all around the ability to access data. And I think looking back, this has been a big topic for us a year ago. These are large data sets that these devices put off. There's tons of data coming out of hospitals, imaging centers, CROs, software systems all the time. And I think one approach was to look at how we can best leverage this data. And then obviously the COVID impact hit our industry, and now everybody's looking to do this remotely. How can we leverage the tools we have to do videos and be able to capture some of these large data sets and gain insights like never before with some of the limitations we're seeing in the industry. So this topic, the connecting patient data and devices with deep analytics, I think is really timely in terms of how we look at the industry and the best ways to leverage this data for clinical trial use. So as Brian mentioned, just to kind of recap everybody, I'm Troy Schneider. So I'm on the Acorn team here at Metadata, and we really focus on solving future state problems and really helping our top clients and really across the industry with ways they can best leverage data. And later we're going to hear from Aaron as well. So Aaron is the head of real world evidence and research at Acorn, and a great colleague of mine. So he's going to go through some of the insights and analytiks and how we can take actions on some of the data we're having access to today. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a kind of a different look at this. So we're going to look in the lens of coronavirus and pandemic, and we'll hold the debate on if we're still in the first wave or the second wave for another time. But point is, how we fundamentally operate in life sciences has changed today. And how can we leverage technology and better applications to connect all the data sources we see? And what kind of insights and actions can we drive from that data? And I think it's just a really interesting topic at a really interesting time. I think to best get into that, though, we really need to understand when we say data, what does that mean? And what are we seeing in metadata across the industry in terms of what kind of data are we helping clients obtain? And so when we say tremendous amount of data, we really mean that. We're talking about often terabytes of data that are really gold mines for future R&D decisions or to help your current stakeholders with the current clinical trials they're running. So we're talking everything from imaging data. So if you're running, cardiovascular trials, what data can we pull off an echocardiogram or an angio? Or better yet, how can we take this imaging data in combination with medical history and maybe genomic data and maybe artificial intelligence and be able to better find potential subjects for your clinical trial or identify misdiagnosis? that combined also with both EDC, but also EMR data is huge. So, you know, being able to pull out key data fields in EMR systems in near real time, I think everybody would agree, removing those disparate systems and hurdles to get EMR data would be huge when it comes to things like R&D, claims data, commercial insights, physician performance, hospital performance around your drug or device. Tremendous amount of data there. Also, when we look at what we call surgical data or telemetry data, so monitoring a physician's or a surgeon's actions, or, you know, there's a number of commercial robots that are coming on the scene and really changing what we call digital surgery. So the use of everything from augmented reality to virtual reality, but then just simple, you know, Intuitive started the robotic surgery movement, but you're seeing a lot of other vendors get in that space. How can we track the performance over time from different calibrations on different robotic surgery programs? And then obviously we've seen a tremendous amount of growth in telemedicine. So what insights and data can we take off, and how can we best capture while being protective and sensitive around privacy? What can we learn from video data, video feeds, and how can we better exchange that data? And then also we have documents or source data. So, you know, these are really critical for the relationship between sites and monitors. So how do we look at that relationship and the exchange of that data? So these are just some examples of the large data sets we're seeing in the industry, and that a lot of Medidata clients are asking our Acorn team, look, how can we better access these? How can we better combine them for better insights, or maybe cross-querying or future R&D decisions? And really, what's our strategy around this large data? And then all of a sudden, we had to shift that view. And I wanted to share something that McKinsey put together later this spring. This was obviously a few months into kind of the United States being impacted and sort of lagging behind in terms of our response, but seeing some of our elective surgeries put on hold, how would this impact the medical device community? And I think they did a good job sort of highlighting that medical device companies that really keep the physician and patient engagement high while ramping up their digital capabilities and doing as most they can remotely are going to be in a much better position in the post-coronavirus recovery in terms of their relationships. Meaning how you leverage technology now is really going to impact your relationships with your large enrolling clinical trial sites, but also your large volume commercial sites, ones that are using your device often. So whether this causes us to look at how do medical device companies handle monitoring going forward? Is it a risk-based monitoring approach? Is it a hybrid of remote monitoring versus on-site visits? How can we better leverage telemedicine to do some of those aspects? And then also the commercialization. We really need to look at ourselves as the industry and wonder, do we need a medical device rep in the operating room for most procedures? What can be done in terms of pre-surgical planning using software in advance versus doing that on site, say in a cath lab or with a surgeon or you know, a physician's assistant every time? What can we do remotely to better prepare ourselves? And I think I would definitely recommend this McKinsey report because it really gives some good ideas and some solid research behind that this really is going to change the way we all interact with the hospitals and especially the surgeons and study coordinators. So when we really look at this, we kind of like to say lots of data equals lots of problems, really. So we have some complex questions here on the left. So these are what our clients are facing. So there is a lot of data, but really what they want to ask themselves is, okay, we want to acquire this data, we agree, but how do we get the rights to do this? How can we acquire this data? How can we store it? You know, we don't maybe have as a sponsor, maybe they don't have scalable single instance multi-tenant infrastructures that they can ramp up based on demand. You know, how do we aggregate this and put it into a usable format? And then most importantly, how do we ensure through workflows that the right people get access or insights or alerts at the right time? And then overall, who manages and sort of guides this strategy? And we have to do everything on the left as remotely as possible. You can see sort of the guidance that came out from AdvaMed, and I think they're up to about 25 associations that sort of recommend as much as possible medical device companies working with these hospitals remotely. So putting together sort of a transformational strategy around accessing this data, but keeping in mind what we see on the right, that let's try to do this remotely, remote EMR connections, being able to set up machine learning to pull out the right data at the right time and send it to people in the cloud, I think is going to be really important. So if we look back at some of the data examples, the 5 data examples we gave earlier, let's dive into each of those and see maybe some areas where we could learn to better pull this data out and aggregate it into a model, and then how we could look to manage that more appropriately. And so imaging data, this is huge. We still see in the industry, sad to report, that 20 to 25% of all images are still transferred on CD or hard media. So whether you're handing a CD to a patient, or in some cases like an aneurysm, you're actually taping the CD to a patient's chest as they're transported across town to a level 1 trauma center, we still see this being a problem. Or FTP, which isn't that much better than moving CDs. So how do we relook or rethink at how we're acquiring this imaging data? And for those in research, especially in cardiovascular or orthopedics or a lot of medical device therapeutic areas, this is often your primary or secondary endpoint. So let's reinvent how we get access to this imaging data and how we can do secondary use cases with it. Pre-surgical planning, a lot of devices now are fit based on the anatomy, so they're 3D printed or custom device manufactured. How do we better track or look at complaints or revision rates? Is there a way where we can start to collect imaging data to look at that more in advance? How can we proactively scan hospital PAC systems to potentially find patients that meet our protocol, our enrollment criteria? Those are all things that are in action now. And a lot of that is powered by that last bullet, which is the artificial intelligence or machine learning. So tons and tons of data, as you can see in the example of the CT scan down there. We're talking gigs of files and frames of patients' anatomies that we can recursively scan through and pull off the right data and make the right people aware of this. And I think medical device companies are really rethinking sort of the importance of this imaging data. So we're talking a lot about an R&D context today, but you got to think downstream as well. So in this example, we're talking about every surgical case, you have to have multiple stakeholders review these images, provide annotations, analyze the images, and then suggest to the surgeon that potential size or approach for that device. And that's for one surgical case. And so for things like a lot of your TAVR cases or your stent grafts, left atrial appendage, or even total joint replacements, this is happening thousands of times around the globe, where we're having images fly all over the place in uncompliant manners. And for companies, it's hard to build a strategy if you don't have a centralized method for bringing in imaging and having people review it. In terms of EMR data, so we talked about imaging data, EMR data is the other big request we get. So how do we pull in the right EMR data at the right time? And it is like finding a needle in a haystack. So we have to be sure we're looking for the right fields and have that data pushed to us, where we can, again, do some of those cross combination of data sources for those insights that are helpful to your R&D teams. But being able to work with multiple EMR vendors, make it very scalable, being able to help with patient treatments and pathways, and also be able to pull off key things like source data. I know there's a big topic right now why monitors can't get on site, but how do we have a system that allows us to peek inside the EMR for what we need to monitor or review, SDR, in combination with a tool that can allow us to upload documents. So whether those are PDFs or handwritten notes, how do we get all that in and have these millions of data points from disparate systems and be able to do something meaningful with it? So we really want to look at how we're looking at EMR data. And then on top of all of that, which is a lot, you look at all these other data sources, which I think are really important to medical device companies. Again, surgeon performance. And this can even boil down to really hospital data. So everything from your referring physician to the main surgical center to imaging centers, there's that whole hub and spoke model in each city. That we can really monitor how specific referring physicians are referring to different physicians or surgeons at university centers, for instance. We talked about the video, document data, sensor data I know is really hot, whether you're talking about ePro or actual sensors for patients, e-consent, and then being able to dive into other third-party data sources like genomic data or even your CRM data. You'd be surprised how many medical device companies have a lot of data and say, for instance, their Salesforce accounts. So what can we do to discover these insights outside of just your medical imaging or your EMR data? So those are kind of the big questions or the big topics that are floating around. And really what we want to do is look at kind of 4 points about where we're at now with this. So we think, and Aaron will talk about later, that, you know, both pharmaceutical, but in this case, especially medical device, have a ton of data sets, but they're not fully leveraging it. You know, we're talking even device data. So your average rhythm management data, your some of your custom devices, they're feeding off tons of data each time, or especially around those connected devices. As a result, I think we're missing opportunities to do next generation machine learning to, again, help us find potential new subjects or misdiagnosis or patients that are having adverse events or making correlation between the device performance and hospital admittance. There's a lot of things that we could dive into if you have a strategy around the data. So, you know, site access, we talked about it from the McKinsey report. So with face-to-face access and those relationships limited, how can we substitute that with a sound technology or software strategy to still communicate with our hospitals from time to time? And what kind of monitoring or analytics can we run on top of that to help people in those relationships make those decisions? And so I think most importantly is, how do we bring all this data together and make it meaningful for your device companies? And we're looking at this in 2 ways. One, in terms of a clinical trial, but then also in terms of the commercialization of your devices. So those are big topics. You could have workshops on all of them. There are a lot of workshops on all of them: EMR data, strategy around imaging data, machine learning. But these are the things we're working on within Medidata, especially within our Acorn division, and a lot of engagements we're having right now with clients about how to look at this going into 2021 and the impact COVID has had on their relationships with hospitals. So it's been a really interesting time. I would say the key, the foundation of those conversations a lot of time is what Medidata, what we call our connected patient platform. So this is built on about 10 years of proven technology connecting thousands of hospitals with, you know, the Medidata infrastructure to pull out this complex data and queue it up to the right people involved at the right time. So if we look at what we call our connected patient platform, you can notice on the left side, these are all the examples we just talked about in terms of data that we may want access to. So this is really, as it says at the top, the integration of all of this next generation data with the ecosystem, which would be the medical device companies in this case. So we are able, and are doing today, the ability to use the Medidata footprint through this portal to pull out EMR data. So whether that's your lab data, your source data, key fields or reports, we can do the same with imaging data, whether it's a radiology information system or most likely a PAC system, or in some cases straight from the scanners. So you can imagine about a patient still being on scanner or in a lobby when we're running edit checks or running machine learning on it to find out potential misdiagnosis. If we compare it to algorithms in the cloud for, say, you know, the American Cardiology Society's standard for heart disease, we can run some of those metrics and report right back to the physician a percent likelihood of a diagnosis. There's some really cool things we're doing and in near real time and pulling off this EMR data, imaging data, and then also we talked about robotic data or your CRM data or your device data. But in essence, having a strategy to standardize the ingestion of all this data. And then in that connected patient platform right there in the middle, you can see all the different things we can do based off that. So once you have a strategy to acquire the data and the permissions and the privacy in place to do that, then you can do things like be able to send it to the right team at the right time. So be able to view in a FDA cleared medical image viewer, or be able to have the ability to see masked source documents or key EMR fields if you're involved with a certain study. So workflow management really important. Aaron's going to talk about also the ability, once you have all this data in one cloud-based system, how you can run analytics and insights off that data. And then also, you know, I think we'd get kicked out of any webinar nowadays if you didn't talk about artificial intelligence or machine learning. But these are real things. You know, these are real things we're running now through partners and at Medidata, where we can take this data and start to run it through AI workbenches and again, present percent likelihoods of, say, COVID diagnosis based off a chest X-ray or a CT scan. So again, we'll dive into some of the examples there, but then you can see the output on the right. So these are all in practice use cases we have with top medical device companies using this connected patient platform. And so I want to be clear on that. These are things that are tied to real cases right now at some of the top hospitals across the globe for pre-surgical planning, MDR submission, health economics and outcomes, the ability to collect source documents for a remote monitoring strategy, being able to identify potential subjects for a patient, or even help calibrate some of your robotic or digital surgery tools. So there's a lot of interesting things there. And when we kind of dive into any of those, it all starts with the data acquisition. So there's really three ways to look at it: your data acquisition, the workflow data, and then the viewing of data. So the acquisition, we've said since the start, is one of the key things. How do you get behind the hospital firewalls and be able, with the right permissions, to grab this important data? So Medidata, very fortunately, through this connected patient platform, is connected to nearly 20,000 sites, many of which we can actually, without VPNs, all through the cloud, be able to pull off all the data you see here on the right and put that into a common data model, even run edit checks against it. Then the ability, as we looked at on the previous workflow slide, the ability to configure special workflows. So it's one thing to bring in the data, then a lot of companies are like, cool, we have access to it, but if you don't know what to do with it, if it's not going to the right people, then it can be meaningless. So it needs to be fit for purpose and go with purpose to the right place. So we're looking at configurable workflows, the ability to alert your study teams or your study coordinators or data management or clinical operations anytime an adverse event or query or anything like that is triggered in the tool. And then what's the use of good workflow if you don't have the ability to have real-time viewing? So iPad, workstation, any device, the ability, without installing software, let me see my images. Let me see a mass de-identified handwritten note from a doctor. Let me see a genomics report, or let me be able to go in and do querying across these different sources to see what I really have in terms of this data. So these are really the three areas that we're focused on at Medidata in the connected patient platform: is data acquisition, and we talked about all the different data we can bring in, the ability to have unique and configurable workflows so the right people on your teams get this data at the right time, and then the ability to view it in a common model, run reports, and just as importantly, be able to run analytics and insights off this. So with that being said, I'm going to turn this over to Aaron to kind of dive into, now that we have this data, what is our approach around the analytics and the modeling we can get from this data? Aaron?
Thank you, Troy. Go to the next slide, please. So I'm Aaron Goloznik, physician by training. As Troy mentioned earlier, I'm responsible for real-world evidence research, and here to talk to you about how we can leverage this type of integrated data approach to getting that. So as Troy mentioned, a very important part of this is just the fact that you're able to bring this various disparate type of data together. You talk about EMR data, billing data, claims data, imaging data, other just operational data together in one common place where one can look at it in a common platform to access it. That's the first step, because you can't access the data, you can't do anything with it. From there, the other thing that we bring and is important to doing this kind of work is standardizing the data. So in other words, now data from even a given data type, if it's coming from different systems or different hospitals, for instance, there may be variations in how it's formatted. There's a need to then translate that data or adapt it to, say, a common data model or data format to enable cross-source comparison within a given data type. We see this particularly with EMR data and claims data. particularly EMR data, because even if data from different hospitals, for instance, is from the same platform, the installation may vary slightly from hospital to hospital. The nice thing about having a centralized platform is one can actually put in place and automate the ETL scripts to convert and harmonize that data so one can look across it in a broad federated fashion. Also, I think Troy mentioned this earlier, having a centralized cloud-based platform to do this also means that as data comes in, automatic quality checks can be deployed to ensure the consistency and accuracy of the data coming in. Are fields missing? You weren't expecting? Is the file size what you expect? And there's an opportunity for this to be automated, not only for routine checks, but also for more advanced applications. I think some of the error correction and flagging can be in fact powered by AI approaches, which definitely speeds up the time to be able to get a rich, multifaceted data set in order to use for various questions and applications. So from there, I think by having data in one place, having it in a common format for the given type of data it is, and being able to look across the different data types, that's where you're really able to power and enable robust visualization and analytics. This could be either using traditional sources for ad hoc querying, such as SAS, R, Python, SQL programming languages, or if you want to layer in more sort of analytic and visualization apps or tools to facilitate more automated reporting or dashboarding or repeat ad hoc routine queries. That's another thing that is enabled by having this type of environment and setup. So that could be anything from, say, Tableau or Spotfire visualizations, or in case we have our own tool, a quantum tool, which lets you do longitudinal patient level analysis over time with a lot of applications for disease insight or for outcomes research purposes and applications. And I think something that also Troy touched on is by bringing all this data together, the ability to integrate across different data sources leads to some very interesting possibilities. I'll get to that more later with the next slide, but I think, as was mentioned, with some of the newer devices, especially the implantable devices that generate their own data streams, a way to systematically bring that data in, ensure it's de-identified, compliant to work with, protecting HIPAA, but then use it alongside other data, whether it be your CRM data, your operational data, your clinical data, opens a whole world of possibilities of what you can do analytically. So I'll go to the next slide now and talk about some of the applications of this type of deep insight you can get from this multifaceted data approach. Pre-surgical population management. Troy already mentioned earlier the sheer amount of data that can come to bear just for planning, preparing for a single case. Review of labs, review of imaging findings, understanding the patient's pre-surgical risks. Now explode that out to an entire population level within a hospital system or across a geographic area, to be able to have that richness of data, understand the breadth of population out there, not only those scheduled perhaps to come in for surgery, but those who may be candidates for surgery in the future. Things like demographics, comorbidities, patterns in diagnostic testing, how they're being managed non-surgically or prior surgeries before coming in. And this isn't just an application for care management for health systems and hospitals. In a clinical trial context, as we're here to talk about, that can be very useful for understanding what is the population into which you are going to be launching a novel device. If you're going to conduct a trial in that device, what are you going to expect to see from a recruitment standpoint? Are the types of patients you're seeking, are they readily available? Do you need to adjust your inclusion criteria in order to better match the real-world population? Moving from there, there's going to actually understanding the surgical patterns of care. And this is, I think, a very unique opportunity by bringing this type of data together in one place, in one platform, is think about the richness of clinical data, lab data, imaging data, and being able to overlay that with data, say, from the surgical information system from within a hospital or surgical center, to actually understand in detail what goes on in that operating room environment. What type of patients are coming in? Can you look at them by different subgroups? What's the case mix severity? What's the range of different procedures brought to bear for different conditions? I think one particular example also is like the increasing use of robotic assist devices. Are they being used? How are they being used? And for any type of device procedure, are there changes over time in terms of how different case types are being approached from a surgical approach or device perspective? And then also understanding post-operatively what happens to these patients. What's their time to discharge? How long are they in the hospital? For instance, what's their time? How long are they in the PACU? How long are they in the SICU before they go home? And being able to bring to that just operational data you can get from a surgical information system, the richness of clinical data from, say, EMR, imaging, or lab data can be very powerful. Then what happens when patients leave the hospital post-surgically? How are they doing? How do they do? You're able to follow them using, say, for instance, the EMR claims data. What happens to them? And you're able to, by linking this data back to, say, the operational data from the hospital, the ability to dive and understand this by procedure type, by subpopulation detail, things that are hard to do with the claims or EMR data alone, where often the specific device information is just not available. Quality metrics can be gathered readily and in this fashion too. Complication rates, readmission rates, surgical revision rates, which are very important for demonstrating product performance, as well as very important for institutions for understanding how they're performing care-wise. And this can layer into also value assessments in, say, with health economics or outcomes research space, in terms of understanding comparative effectiveness, cost of care, cost effectiveness, or value-based contracts. And this also applies to the clinical trial and R&D setting, because if you have a sense for in the market or in the population how different procedures play out in terms of what kinds of patients get the procedures, what kind of outcomes they have, that can be very powerful for understanding things like what comparators am I up against in the real world? How are patients performing on those? What does this mean in terms of how I need to power or structure or design my clinical study if I want to ensure that I can show a differentiated effect of my device versus what's already out there? So in essence, whether it's pre-surgical, intrasurgical, post-surgical, there's a lot more you can gain insight-wise being able to bring this type of disparate types of data together in one place to focus on and analyze. From here, I think I'm going to turn it back to Troy to go through some use cases that specifically giving a little more detail on how this could look.
Thanks, Aaron. So the first one I want to start with is really how, when you're thinking how to metadata establish, or Acorn establish these gateways and these connections to these hospital systems to pull this data off. Well, one of the biggest way we've done that is from pre-surgical planning, where access to hospital data, EMR data, and imaging data is critical to patient care, and it has to be done in a matter of hours in terms of collaborating ahead of a patient's case. You could also, let's use kind of the term art of possible here, you can also make parallels from this to actually remote monitoring. So same concept. If we look at back in the day, several years ago, medical device reps were always going on site to talk to the surgeon. All right, let's bring up the echo, let's bring up the CT, let's look at access, let's look at screening, let's look at sizing, and let's look at the suggested approach, and we're going to do this in person, and I'm going to monitor how you're working up this case, and then I'll make sure everything looks correct as a medical device representative. I'll also come back on site and advise you if needed in the OR, plus I'll make sure we have the right products on hospital. In the monitoring world, we were sort of doing the same thing. So we were coming on site to monitor and look over the shoulders of these study nurses, staff at hospitals to ensure the quality and data. And I think this being able to access this compliantly remotely has fundamentally changed how medical device reps work in pre-surgical planning, but also in terms of remote monitoring. We can now use tools that metadata has to do source document review, proper masking, the ability to issue queries or communicate between monitors and sites. Very similar again to that medical device rep and the surgeon and their relationship and being able to see key information. So the challenge we faced that allowed us to address both of these was the need in near real time for them to make decisions on patient care. So they would have to get CDs or DVDs, which were usually shipped to their house, or they'd have to drive across town, or in some cases where you don't have a big device team, they'd have to fly out to the hospital to look at images and EMR data in person. So you can see on the bottom all the data that's needed for a typical case, whether it's a TAVR case or again, maybe a total knee replacement. Everyone had heavy in-person relationships and a lot of time wasted in terms of traveling, hotel expenses, airfare. So you can see the parallels here with monitoring I'm getting at. In the pre-surgical planning, they sort of scrapped their way of doing things, which was, we want to build that relationship. We want to ensure with our own eyes in person that everything's going to plan. Well, eventually you can take a hybrid approach and be able to do complex cases in person, but your standard cases remotely. So Medidata helped implement a real-time exchange where images came straight off the scanner, straight from the hospital, straight to the medical device company, where they could access this data, combine with their medical history, be able to annotate, put notes in, suggested approaches, and send it right back to the physician in a pre-surgical workbook. We actually saw this cut 85% time in terms of surgical reduction. So let's say you have a loved one that has an aneurysm. Instead of them waiting 7 to 10 days for the medical device rep, the medical device company, a 3D rendering to go back to the hospital, sign off, and then that actual surgical procedure to happen, this was all being done instead of 7 to 10 days down to 1 to 2 days. And we'd like to see the same parallels. We're working on some case studies now around remote monitoring and the ability to look at source documents in near real time and have those monitors sort of flag adverse events or issue queries back to the sites versus having to travel on site. Now, there's always still going to be a hybrid or some touch in person, but we can see a number of visits being able to be done remotely. And we've noticed the regulatory guidance be very favorable to doing this in some regions. So that's one of the big ones is pre-surgical planning or remote monitoring for this case. Really optimize both patient outcomes, but overall study flow because of these tools and our ability to pull in imaging data and EMR data and documents in real time and have them securely presented to the right people. The next would be the surgical approach analysis. So this was the ability for, again, a team, so a medical device company, they need to look at why surgeons were making certain decisions, and same context holds true in a clinical trial about why surgeons were making some assessments or some assumptions or some methodologies ahead of surgical procedures. In this case, we were talking about orthopedic procedures, why these were happening and what were we seeing in terms of revisions or outcomes. And so in this case, we wanted to understand how physicians look at ligament tension scores, which is a key indicator, both prior to surgery and then after surgery, and then correlating that to their surgical approach and whether they were able to use a robotic surgery versus doing this by hand from a traditional standard of care methodology by the surgeon. So we were able to pull all the data listed below, both the pre-surgical and post-surgical assessment data, the telemetry data, the robotic surgery settings, the outcomes data, and actually CRM data to look at the time of case, how many cases the doctor is doing, how many cases that hospital A is doing compared to hospital B. And we're able to present some really interesting results. So again, for those medical device teams that are working in health, real world evidence or health economics, these are really compelling things that maybe people have always wondered or wanted to look at, but didn't have access to the data that we're able to help provide through the connected patient platform. So in this case, to answer kind of this age-old question with kind of a new age twist of the robotic surgery is surgical performance and how they're using a key indicator. So like jet velocity for TAVR procedures, in this case, it's ligament tension scores for orthopedic surgeries. How's our approach and how's our success of the procedure going to go based on that one score? Really interesting stuff. And we're able to present through a pretty slick interface. You can see on the right, acquire the EMR data, look at sensor data, ePro data from the actual patient, and be able to present these findings back with an analytic solution. So they're able to see through this interface very clearly the success of each approach and the percent likelihood of success based on the ligament tension score, which ties back into the original theory. So I think you're going to see more and more projects like this start to come about, especially as elective surgeries return. Another one, which Aaron, you can go over, is patient outcomes tracking. I know you've been doing some interesting things there.
Thank you, Troy. So again, we talked about how this type of platform can aid with pre-surgical planning, understanding surgical approaches, but also a little more detail about how this applications for understanding what happens in a post-surgical setting. So this particular case example comes from a device in the cardiovascular metabolic disease space. And really the idea was post-surgically, how do patients do? And beyond the more near-term endpoints, such as surgical revision and complication rate, and not as far as going to say, CV event occurrence, but are there more ways you guys have more granular ways to follow how patients fare and progress over time? In this case, the idea was to use transitions and changes to the pharmaceutical therapies as a proxy for how patients are faring or how their disease is worsening or the level of control they're obtaining with their CV metabolic disease. There's been precedent for doing that in this disease space, and it gives you a more timely indicator of how patients are faring, for instance. So in order to conduct this validation, the idea is start with a rich variety of data on patient demographics, comorbidities, symptoms, labs, medications, procedures, and really use that data to get some deep insights into really, I'd say, the natural history of the disease, to really understand that as patients change from their particular therapy, as stronger agents are added, as agents are changed, to escalate along the care continuum, essentially what is associated with that transition happening, and how well can you rely on that transition as a proxy for how patients are doing over time. Before we took that, if you go to the next slide, it's really, yes, in fact, verifying that the line of therapy definition can be used as a proxy for understanding post-surgically how patients fare, but also by understanding the various elements associated with driving or predicting a particular transition, there's a further opportunity to, say, align this type of analysis with, I guess, I would say, means for further feedback into the patient care process. I mean, a transition in care could be an alert trigger back to the CRM to the doctor that perhaps the patient's disease control is not doing so well, and you do something. Or move upstream into more of the predictive space. Maybe when you start to see a certain constellation or pattern of things happening, that may be signs of an impending change in patient's level of comorbidity that may also require some more outreach or intervention. So possibilities both for understanding what happens post-surgically, as well as perhaps enabling real-time action that can be taken. So we think a very powerful application that can come from this. Okay, go from there to the next slide. So really, to wrap it up, what comes next? So with the emergence of platforms like this that finally provide a holistic way to integrate previously disparate data sets, there's a lot more capability to combine these data sets, look across these data sets, and derive a greater richness of insights that was not readily possible. I mean, thinking about Troy's story from the beginning of the talk about the hospital that found it easier to bring in cadavers to study hip size rather than use their own radiological data that was right there. We can definitely do better. With platforms like this, we will do better. Also, I think by putting data centrally in a place with a more real-time access to updates and feeds, there's the ability for greater actionability of insights. Can you better deploy algorithms? Can they be scaled across a broader set of data, a broader set of institutions? And can triggers be put in place that can allow actionable follow-ons and responses to the insights that you generate? Closing the loop, if you will. Also, I want to go back to what Troy said from the McKinsey report about the advances in how the market is anticipated to shift in terms of how we interact with patients, with physicians in a interconnected fashion. We talked about tumor boards, image analysis, diagnostic screening, for instance, but ways to make that whole process and dialogue more interactive, more engaging, all at the same time while being more virtual and remote, which leads us to the next point, which is we're currently in an environment where face-to-face interaction in a clinical context, whether it be for clinical care or for clinical trial, is harder. We don't know when things will return to normal. We don't know when another pandemic like this may come. So going forward, by investing in these types of data-driven, holistic, integrated approaches, one also prepares oneself for a future where one can only be more interconnected to greater enhance the way with which we interact with patients, with physicians, the way we conduct clinical trials, but also we can, how should I say, further proof ourselves against further disruptions that and maintain interconnectivity and enhance it in a time when perhaps that type of connectivity may be disrupted or challenged. So thank you all today. I think this concludes the prepared remarks part of our presentation.
Thank you, gentlemen. Have a sip of water. You've done a lot of talking, so I'm going to start with our question and answer. First one that has come in is, could you describe what protocols metadata use to secure data, both static and in transit, and ensure patient privacy and analytics output?
Okay. I can take part of that. So I think it depends on the type of data format. So I think in the case of data coming from individual institutions, commonly that's done through a business associate agreement to permit the handling of sensitive patient information, for instance. And where that's not a route that's available, we also employ de-identification and tokenization processes in order to strip out PHI, but still allow linkage and combination of data. That's another route we take. Other route is some of these data sources, for instance, are already de-identified, like some of the more commercially available claims in EMR data sets, in which case permission is relatively straightforward. The data has already been de-identified, so there's no need for further action. It does get interesting when you talk about combining disparate types of data together, because the more facets you bring together, even if the data has been de-identified, there is the possibility of inadvertent re-identification. But there are certain certifications and tests that are conducted on the data to ensure low probability of statistical re-identification, and facilitating that type of checking and providing those certifications on data is another thing that we do routinely.
Yeah, and Aaron, I'd add really good points from a technical standpoint. It really depends on the use case, but metadata, obviously, GDPR compliant. We're looking at encrypting both at rest and in transit. We have protocols designed around HL7, FHIR, and DICOM web transfer of this data. And we're really looking at using tools like HIPAA exemptions in clinical trials, where some of this data can be exposed. And then also in commercial use cases, if you're a medical device company in the continuum of care, you have certain access and rights to PII or PHI. But at the end of the day, we've done a really good job of building in configurable tools that allows you to de-identify or mask this data where you feel you need to, while having kind of the security and privacy tokens you need to feel comfortable.
Great, and another question that's come in is the EMR only for US hospitals, and does patient privacy happen because it lives in your EDC?
I'll say that EMR data is most readily available in US hospitals, because oftentimes institutions will have the provisions set up ahead of time to permit use of the EMR data if de-identified for quality improvement or research purposes. This is still a possible route in Europe, but again, one does have to be mindful of GDPR requirements, which case we can support that by, in some cases, by making sure that the instances or cloud instances where data is hosted are local, meaning country or regional, depending on country requirements. And also, if opt-in permissions are required at the patient level, that's something we can facilitate with our patient portal approach. Did I get that right, Troy?
Yeah, I think, look, some of these are hard without a dialogue around the question. You're assuming context, but the use case, again, is really critical. So most of the examples where we're pulling EMR data are in the US. We do have some really cool projects going on in Japan and Australia that are very similar. And in the EU, we are pulling out, it's one thing to pull out a field or two in EMR, but if we're getting into pulling out entire source documents for SDR, SDV, that's been very murky or kind of muddy guidance there. And so those are things we're comfortable advising to sort of stay away from doing some of these things in certain regions.
Yeah. And I'll add about Europe. I think I talked about common data standards. A lot of more what we do see in Europe is more of a federated data approach when it comes to EMR data. For instance, if all the institutions who want to work on a study together harmonize to a common data standard, the OMOP common data model is a common one, then they're all able to conduct analysis independently while assuring that the data is structured the same way. They can share the same code and definitions. So pretty much at the end, they're able to combine results together in a way if allowing individual level data to leave their premise really is a concern. That's another thing we see often in Europe and can facilitate.
Here's another one. Does the end user program the metadata system uses to extract data of interest, or is that done by metadata on a consulting basis? If by the end user, how much training is typically required? I can reread that if you want me to.
I think that really comes down to the end user's level of technical comfort and fluency. We see both types of clients. Some clients have made significant investments in their own internal data marts or data lakes, for instance, and are very comfortable with having a centralized environment within which to work with data. And usually in that case, they're very interested in hands-on access to data, assuming it's of course been de-identified and you work in that fashion. And in which case the idea is to set up the environment and the data so that one can work with it, whatever one's tool of choice is, SAS, R, Tableau, Spotfire, for instance, or our tools. Others, yes, perhaps if it's depending on the scale or stage of the company or how advanced their investment IT is, may prefer a consultative engagement approach, or may prefer to start with a consultative approach before progressing or scaling up. The nice thing about a cloud-based solution is we can flex it up or flex it down depending on the client needs. Troy, do you want to add anything to
that? No, I think you're spot on. I think metadata, we do a good job of giving you the choice. So some of these are, and we all work in this industry, we know these are complex topics with multiple vendors that we're trying to solve. Sometimes those are best off as us consulting and doing sort of custom setups. But especially, we do have a lot of clients that want to be enabled to set up their own instances and can talk to the hospitals, and we can give them and teach them and give them the keys to the car to run their own programs and turn on and off different, say, faucets of data coming into the tool. And so we see a mixture of both. It really depends.
Here's one that you both probably should easily be able to hit out of the park. How differentiated is metadata versus your other competitors?
So Aaron, I'll start. Yeah, I think from this standpoint, it's all about our view in this. So this is something we really started to put a lot of our own internal R&D and sweat equity in several years ago. So being able to have the footprint metadata has, that all of you on the phone or any of our partners or vendors can flip that switch. A lot of our connections to these external systems are generic in purpose, meaning it's a relationship between metadata and that hospital for extended use cases. So if you have a new use case, you're able to leverage that metadata footprint. And we have a great mix of being able to focus on providing incredible software in the life sciences space, but also bring in experts and SMEs to help, like Aaron, to help share best practices. And that's pretty rare, I think, in this industry to have that mix. And so we can look at these complicated problems and have experience seeing them through from proof of concept all the way into running at full scale and you getting insights that you want to off the tool. So it's that mixture of footprint and experience, and this is what we do, and we do it really well.
Yeah, I'll build on that. And I would say metadata started as a company that sought to be, basically improve the standardization and gathering of data throughout the development process of life science and device products. What that gives us is a broad perspective across that cycle and familiarity with the different types of data elements when used at different stages, which means we can bring to it a common holistic perspective of the end-to-end process. And also, good analytics starts with good data. And when your core DNA started with standardizing, mastering, and cleaning of data, good analytics follows.
Great. And then here's one last question. What potential use cases do you see for biopharma with the metadata platform?
Frankly, it's a lot of the same types of applications, I would say. I think the kind of things we talked about on the device side in terms of being able to link, perhaps everything from understanding product-specific insights to perhaps triggers back to CRM to alert physicians or patients. We do a lot of that now, actually, in the specialty pharmacy space, where often you have complex therapeutics being distributed by a specialized, specialty pharmacy chain. And today I would say for clients, we manage triggers and alerts to enable should there be holdups or problems in the process of those medications reaching the patient, um, feeding alerts back to the biopharma company to be able to alert their field team to help support that. For instance, if there's an issue with something with the paperwork for a product, the doctor's office needs to feedback to deal with it, that something can be facilitated. If it's understanding that a patient's something's wrong with their compliance to medication suboptimal, again, alerts can be triggered to feedback there. But also, I think the bringing together of data broadly to support the same use cases biopharma apply to, whether it be understanding populations and for trial planning, whether it be understanding outcomes for purposes of approval or reimbursement, whether it just be informing and understanding how care is happening in the market to help biopharma have intelligent conversations with providers about where their products should be used and in what kind of patients. It's many of the same use cases, I would say.
Troy, anything to add?
Yeah, I would agree with Aaron. Many of the same use cases, and just kind of envision in all the meetings when we used to have those in person, all the times whiteboarding where you kind of say, if only we had access to this, or could see behind the scenes at what's truly going on with this patient or this hospital. These are the type of tools that give you those insights. So if you really want to know what a certain source document says, or if somebody had an adverse event, did they come in for an image and how can we see that? Do we know their genotype? Do we have that genomic data, and can we combine that with EDC and EMR data to slot this person in the right trial? Those are all the things that we're giving you visibility to that maybe you didn't have before.
Well, excellent. Let me just see if we have one more here. Nope, we don't. Just a thank you from the audience for your insightful answers to both of you. And we're up against the hour, so that completes our program for today. I want to thank Aaron and Troy and the rest of the metadata team for working with us on this 3-part series. This will all be available on demand. I want to thank you for taking your time to learn with us today. Your time is very valuable to us, and we always want to make sure that we fill it with the information that you can use to be more successful in your business venture. So on behalf of MassMedic and Metadata and Acorn, I want to thank you all for your time and wish you all a safe and healthy day. Take care.
Thank you all.